Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video.
Thanks for watching. Follow a brighter destiny for more powerful stories, and don't forget to subscribe.
Deborah Whitfield tore the check into 4 pieces before Marcus Ellison's hand had even finished pulling away from the counter. She let the scraps drift down onto the marble floor like she was scattering confetti at her own private parade, and she did it 3 feet from where his 8-year-old daughter stood clutching a stuffed rabbit against her chest. "People like you don't walk into my branch with a check like this," she said, loud enough that the woman behind her in line stopped scrolling her phone to look up. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He knelt down, picked up his daughter's hand instead of the paper on the floor, and told Deborah quietly that she had just made the most expensive mistake of her career. Before we get into why that sentence turned out to be true down to the dollar, if stories about quiet men and loud consequences are the kind that stick with you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because where this one goes next, you will not want to miss it. Now let's rewind to 9:14 that morning. Backlash was still just an ordinary Tuesday in Fairview Heights, Illinois. Marcus Ellison was 41 years old, and for 6 years he had been the parent his daughter Zoe had ever really needed. Her mother had left for a life in Scottsdale that didn't include either of them, and Marcus had simply absorbed the difference without ever making it a story he told strangers. He drove a 2011 Ford Fusion with a cracked taillight he kept meaning to fix. He wore the same gray canvas jacket he'd bought at a surplus store the year as Zoe was born, the elbows gone soft and shiny from a decade of wear. Nobody at Fairview Elementary knew that the man who showed up to every single parent-teacher conference in that same jacket had built Ellison Capital Group from a single laptop in a rented office into a firm managing $3 billion in client assets. Marcus preferred it that way. He did not want his daughter growing up believing a person's worth could be read off a price tag, so he kept his success folded quietly into the corners of an otherwise unremarkable life. That morning, a wire had cleared into his personal account, confirming the sale of an early stake in a robotics startup nobody outside these had heard of 2 years earlier. The check in his coat pocket read Forder 762 91840 down to the last 40 cents because Marcus never rounded anything, not numbers and not people. Half of that money was already earmarked for a trust that Zoe wouldn't be able to touch until she turned 25. The other half was going to seed something he'd been quietly building blueprints for since the year his marriage ended. A scholarship kid raised being by single mother or a single father, that's exact kind of childhood he understood from the inside out. He brought Zoe along because they had a whole afternoon planned around this one errand: the bank, then the bookstore on Chalmers Avenue, then the diner with the milkshake she'd been talking about since Sunday. He'd even promised her 4 books instead of the usual 2 because for once he was in a genuinely good mood. They walked into the Meridale branch of Prairie Trust Bank at 10:41 in the morning, 11 minutes before Marcus had told Zoe they'd be back in the car. He'd at that branch for 14 years, long before Ellison Capital had an name, and anyone outside a small circle of early investors. But Deborah Whitfield, the branch manager standing behind the service desk that day, had transferred in only 5 weeks earlier. She'd never pulled his account. She had no idea that the faded canvas jacket had a 14-year paper trail sitting 1 keystroke away. Deborah's eyes did the math on Marcus before he'd said a single word. They moved from his jacket to his daughter to the Fusion parked crooked out front, and something in her face had already reached a verdict. 2 other customers in pressed blazers were greeted the moment they crossed the threshold. Marcus and Zoe stood at the counter for 6 foot while 3 tellers stayed conveniently busy. Zoe tugged at her father's sleeve and asked in the small voice kids use when they're trying not to be rude why nobody was helping them yet. Marcus told her patience cost nothing and assumptions cost everything, and that it never to think the worst of people before they'd earned it. When he finally reached the counter and slid the check across, the number caught Deborah's attention like a hook catching skin. Instead of pulling his account, a 30-second task any manager on that floor could have performed, she began questioning him about the source of the funds, her voice climbing high enough that half the lobby turned to look. It. Marcus answered every question without his pulse changing. He handed over his driver's license, his account card, his transaction history, and the notarized documentation from the equity sale. He offered calmly to let her call the issuing bank herself so she could verify everything in under 5 minutes. By any measure that had ever existed in banking, it was more than enough. Deborah looked at the paperwork the way a person looks at something they've already decided not to believe. She told him plainly that a man carrying a check like this wouldn't be driving a car with a cracked taillight or wearing a jacket with the elbows worn through. A young teller named Nora Bishop reached for the phone, offering to make the verification calls herself. But Deborah cut across her before her fingers touched the receiver, ordering her back to her station in a tone that closed the conversation before it opened. By now, several people had their phones out, filming instead of watching. One man near the entrance said, loud enough for Zoe to hear clearly, that a guy like that was probably using his own kid to make a scam look sympathetic. Nobody in that lobby said a word against him. They just kept their phones raised. Zoe's hand found her father's and gripped it the way she used to grip it during thunderstorms when she was 4. Marcus asked Deborah one final time evenly to place the call before this went any further. His calm only seemed to provoke her further. In front of the tellers, the security guard, and every camera pointed his way. She announced the check fraudulent, though she had verified exactly nothing about it. Marcus reminded her, without raising his voice an inch, that she was one phone call away from a very different afternoon. She heard that as a threat instead of the warning it was. She snatched the check off the counter, looked him dead in the eye, and told him people like him didn't walk in here with $5 million. Then she tore once, twice, 4 pieces and let them fall to the tile at his feet in full view of his daughter. The lobby went dead quiet. Zoe bent down like she meant to gather the scraps herself, and Ma stopped her gently, unwilling to let his daughter kneel onto a stranger's floor to collect what someone had just used to humiliate him. Deborah called the police and told the dispatcher a man was using fraudulent documents, threatening staff, and refusing to leave. Then she ordered the branch's security guard, a heavy-set man named Walter Briggs who'd worked there 11 years, to escort Marcus out. Walter hesitated for a full 3 seconds, long enough that Deborah repeated the order louder before his hand settled lightly, almost apologetically, on Marcus's arm. Zoe looked up at the guard, approaching them with an expression no 8-year-old should have to wear inside a bank on a Tuesday morning. Marcus kept his voice low, just for her. Stay close to me, he told her, and this will be over soon. He understood the position he was in perfectly. He could resist and risk turning misunderstanding into something dangerous with his daughter standing beside him, or he could walk calm and let the truth catch up on its own schedule. He chose the second option, but he refused to hurry toward the door before someone confirmed what he already knew. As Walter's hand guided him forward, one slow step at a time, Zoe wrapped both arms around her father's waist and pressed her face into his side. Deborah, not finished yet, called out to a teller to hold the girl back before she and her words obstructed bank staff from doing their job. That was the first time Marcus's composure genuinely cracked. He'd absorbed the insults about his coat and his car. He'd absorbed watching $5 million torn apart in front of strangers. But the second someone suggested laying a hand on his daughter, her voice changed entirely, dropping into a register that left zero room for negotiation. Nobody touches her. Deborah seized on the shift immediately, telling the gathering crowd that his sudden intensity proved exactly the aggression she'd been warning everyone about since he walked in. Nora tried again. This was the second time. She stepped in, reminding Deborah steadily that Marcus hadn't threatened a single person and that one call the issuing bank would settle everything inside of 5 minutes. Deborah turned on her instead, threatening to fire her on the spot in front of a lobby full of recording phones. Nora stopped talking, but something in the way she looked at Marcus afterward suggested she believed every word he'd said, even if she couldn't afford to say so out loud. Zoe looked around at every raised phone and every set of lowered eyes and asked her father in a voice just loud enough to carry why nobody would say he'd done nothing wrong. Nobody answered her. Nobody moved. Marcus felt that silence settle into his chest heavier than anything Deborah had said, because he understood, watching his daughter's face, that she was learning something about the world that no 8-year-old should have to learn on a random Tuesday in a bank lobby. It. At exactly 10:53, the glass door swung open, and Richard Halloway walked in with leather portfolio under one arm and the unhurried posture of a man expecting a quiet afternoon meeting. It. Richard was the Midwest Regional President for Prairie Trust Bank. It. And he'd driven out to the Merridale branch personally after hours away from the kind of attention a downtown office might attract to finalize a $690 million partnership between the bank and a typical group, a deal 11 months in the making, scheduled to close inside the week. Richard took 2 steps inside before his brain caught up with his eyes. Marcus Ellison, the man he'd been preparing to sit across a table from for the better part of an hour, stood with a security guard's hand still rest to his shoulder, his daughter in tears against his side, torn paper scattered across the tile at his feet. Richard's portfolio slipped out of his grip and hit the floor with a flat, heavy sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Mr. Ellison, Richard said, and the 2 words changed the temperature of the entire room. Walter released his grip on Marcus's arm so fast it looked reflexive, like he'd been holding something he suddenly realized he had no right to touch. Deborah moved toward Richard, already explaining that she'd just prevented what she believed was a $5 million fraud attempt. Richard looked at her for a long moment before asking if she had any idea who she'd been talking to. Deborah opened her mouth, then closed it, and for the first time in 11 minutes, she genuinely didn't have an answer ready. In front of every customer still standing in that lobby, Richard explained that Marcus Ellison was the founder of Ellison Capital Group, one of the largest institutional partners the bank currently held, and that the deal on the table was worth $690 million a deal. Marcus was the only person authorized to approve or walk away from it. The check, he added, was entirely legitimate. The issuing bank had confirmed it that same morning, a confirmation Deborah had never once bothered to request before deciding what she believed about the man in the worn jacket. Richard knelt to Zoe's eye level and apologized to her directly, the first anyone in that building had spoken to her like her fear actually mattered. It was a small gesture. It was also the first crack in the wall the whole lobby had built around that morning. The man who'd loudly suggested Marcus was scamming people with his own daughter suddenly found his shoes very interesting and made no effort to meet anyone's eyes. Deborah, recovering her footing, insisted she'd only been following protocol and repeated the word twice, like saying it again might make it retroactively true. Richard gestured at the torn paper still scattered across the floor and asked her to name the exact procedure that authorized a branch manager to destroy a customer's legal property in front of his child. There was no such procedure, there never had been. Deborah pivoted instead, suggesting that bringing his daughter into the bank had made an already tense situation more emotional than it needed to be. That was the sentence that finally used up whatever benefit of the doubt Marcus had left in reserve. Richard ordered her to surrender her badge and her keys on the spot, and told her not to touch her terminal or her phone for any reason, because every kept connected to that account would be preserved for an internal investigation. While everyone's attention stayed fixed on Richard and Marcus, Deborah slipped behind her terminal and tried to delete an internal note she'd flagging Marcus as a high-risk fraud threat. Nora caught the motion out of the corner of her eye, crossed the lobby, and put her hand flat over the keyboard before the deletion finished. She told Deborah plainly the note was staying exactly where it was, then turned to Richard and mentioned that the branch's security cameras had captured the entire incident from 3 separate angles, including the exact moment the check hit the floor. Deborah went pale. She'd forgotten the choices existed. Richard terminated her employment right there in the lobby in front of the same people who had watched her the check apart 11 minutes earlier. Turning to Walter, he took a gentler approach, since the footage confirmed the guard had never used force and had let go the instant Richard spoke. Walter was suspended pending review rather than fired outright, and given a chance to look at the footage clearly before anything permanent got decided. Walter's shoulders dropped, somewhere between relief and shame. "I knew something felt wrong the second she gave that order," he admitted, mostly to himself. "I just didn't trust the feeling enough to say so out loud." The police arrived 9 minutes later, responding to the original call, which had described a man attempting fraud and threatening staff. Because that call had already been logged as an official complaint, the responding officers still had to file a report even after Richard explained the situation had reversed itself entirely. It. One of the officers apologized under his breath while taking Marcus's statement, admitting the dispatch had made it sound far worse than what he was actually looking at. It. Nora gave her account without softening a single detail, including the moment Deborah threatened to fire her for offering to make a phone call. It. Three separate customers who'd been filming came forward and handed over footage showing exactly what had happened, from the check hitting the counter to the moment it hit the floor in pieces. It. A few of them apologized directly to Marcus, admitting they should have said something instead of only reaching for their phones. A 12-second clip of the check being torn apart while an 8-year-old watched was online before the police had even finished taking statements. By the time Marcus and Zoe walked out of that branch that evening, the clip already had thousands of views, a number that would multiply many times over before the sun came up. Within 36 hours, the story had national reach. News vans parked outside the Maridale branch. Reporters discovered that Marcus was a single father who'd raised his daughter for 6 years, and that the money torn apart on that lobby floor had been earmarked for a scholarship fund for kids in exactly his situation. Old photographs of him dropping Zoe off at school surfaced, alongside neighbor interviews describing a quiet man who'd never once mentioned the size of it to one in Fairview Heights. The gap between what that money was meant to do and how its owner had actually been treated deepened the public outrage with every new share. Prairie Trust stock slid 9% in a single trading session. The board convened an emergency call that same evening, less concerned with the girl who'd watched her father get accused of fraud than with the number on the ticker. Richard spent the night fielding calls from executives who wanted the story to disappear quietly. More than one suggested a private settlement before things got any bigger. Richard refused every time, telling them playing Marcus Ellison did not strike him as a man who could be paid into silence, and that trying would likely make things far worse for everyone involved. The internals that followed uncovered a pattern far larger than one bad morning. Deborah had a documented history of freezing or denying accounts belonging to black customers and lower-income customers, and prior complaints against her had been quietly closed by brand leadership long before Marcus ever walked through those doors. Investigators found at least 11 earlier complaints sitting untouched in files, each one closed without meaningful review. One former teller who'd left the branch nearly 2 years earlier told investigators she'd reported an almost identical incident involving an elderly customer whose account Deborah had frozen without any explanation at all. That complaint had been closed inside a week, same as all the others, buried until a check worth nearly $5 million ended up torn apart on the same lobby floor. Within 48 hours, the police formally closed their case, confirming there had been no fraud and no threat of any kind, and noting for the record that Deborah's original report had been false from the start. It was a small, official kind of vindication that did nothing to undo what Zoe had already watched happen to her father. Deborah lost her job, and a formal charge for filing a false police report. Attorneys representing several of her former customers began reaching out within days, asking whether they too had grounds to come forward now that her history was finally being examined in daylight. That first night, Marcus let almost every call go to voicemail. He sat with Zoe at their kitchen table instead, in front of a dinner neither of them had much appetite for, and let the noise stay exactly where it belonged, on the other side of a door he had no intention of opening. It was Zoe who delivered the sentence that actually landed. She looked up at him and asked if anyone would have apologized at all if they hadn't found out he was rich. Marcus set down his fork and had no honest answer for her. He'd been cleared because he happened to hold power. Most people never would. He thought about every stranger who walked into a branch just like that one every single day without a regional president arriving. Time to fix it, and he understood that almost nobody online arguing about his story. Daughters just asked him at their own table. 3 days later, the lawyers arrived at his front porch in suits that looked out of place against the siding and the cracked take-light sedan in the driveway. They laid out a proposal on the same kitchen table where Zoe had asked her question, a public apology, terminations, all in exchange for one condition. Signed the $690 million deal as planned and say nothing further about what said the mayor branch. Marcus let them finish. He thought about Zoe's question, which hadn't left him since the night she'd asked it. He thought about the room full of people who'd stood there filming and saying nothing, agreeing through silence that an injustice happening in plain sight didn't require anyone to lift a finger. He thought about Walter admitting he'd known something felt wrong and hadn't trusted himself enough to act. Punishing one manager wouldn't touch any of that. Only something built to outlast a single news cycle might. He told the lawyers the deal would stay on the table, but he refused the personal settlement outright. He had no interest in being paid to stay quiet. Instead, he laid out a list of conditions that had nothing to do with his own bank account. Every branch would undergo an independent audit for discriminatory conduct run by outside investigators rather than the bank's own compliance office. Any decision to freeze or deny a customer's account would need sign-off from a second manager before it took effect. Customers would have an explicit right to request independent verification instead of being left at the mercy of a single employee's judgment on a bad day. Employees who reported wrongdoing would be protected from retaliation, a condition Marcus insisted on directly because of what he'd watched happen to Nora in that lobby. Frontline staff, including security personnel, would trace recognizing and refusing an order that was clearly wrong instead of following it simply because it came from someone above them. Security footage and transaction records could no longer be deleted once a complaint had been filed. Customer rights would be posted in plain language inside every branch lobby. And Prairie Trust would fund a permanent financial assistance program for single-parent families, seeded with the same money that had once been torn apart on a lobby floor. The board resisted at first, arguing some conditions went far beyond what any single incident required. With the deal and the company's reputation both hanging by the same thread, they had almost no room left to negotiate. Within the week, every condition was written into the final agreement, alongside a public timeline for rollout across every branch in the region. Deborah's banking license was permanently revoked. She now faces a civil rights lawsuit alongside the false report charge. Walter was reinstated once the footage confirmed what everyone already suspected and placed into the very training program Marcus had insisted on, learning alongside her staff how to recognize and refuse an order that crosses a clear line. When he saw Marcus again weeks later, he apologized quietly, admitting he wished he'd trusted his own instincts sooner. Marcus told him there was nothing left to apologize, for he remembered clearly that Walter's hand had never once tightened, and that he'd let go the instant Richard spoke. It was a small distinction, and Marcus wanted him to know it hadn't gone unnoticed. Nora was promoted to assistant branch manager, put in charge of rolling the new training program out across the region, all because she'd been the only person in that lobby willing to say something out loud while everyone else stayed silent. The bank issued a replacement check once the original was formally voided, and Mark split the money, exactly as he'd always planned. Half went into Zoe's trust. The other half became the seed money for the Ellison family scholarship, built to support kids being raised by a single mother or father the way he once had been raised himself. He insisted the very first round of scholarships be administered out of the married branch, the same building that had once refused to believe he belonged there, now responsible for an opportunity to families who looked a great deal like his own. 3 months later, Marcus and Zoe walked back through those same glass doors. He still drove the Fusion with the cracked taillight, and he still wore the same gray jacket, unwilling to change a single thing about himself just because the world had briefly decided his appearance mattered more than it should have. Zoe held his hand the same way she had that first afternoon, except there was nothing tense in her grip this time, just the easy comfort of a kid walking beside her father on an ordinary errand. An employee greeted them within 3 seconds of the door opening, and nobody's eyes lingered on his jacket or his keys before deciding how to treat him. A new placard by the entrance listed customer rights in plain language, with a number for an independent complaint line that had nothing to do with the branch itself. Nairokamar new role to say hello, mentioning that staff training had already rolled out across the entire region, and that early feedback from the branches had come back better than anyone had dared to expect. Walter stood near the door in uniform, and he caught sight of Marcus. He offered a small, genuine nod, a world away from the hesitation Marcus remembered from 3 months earlier. At one counter, a young single mother was opening her son's first savings account, met with none of the suspicion Marcus and Zoe had faced that same afternoon 3 months prior. It. Nobody questioned whether she belonged there. Zoe watched the scene for a long moment, then turned to her father and asked if that was the reason he hadn't simply pulled his money out of the bank forever after everything that happened. Marcus thought about it before he answered, choosing his words the way he always did when he wanted her to actually understand them instead of just hear them. Closing a door is easy, he told her. Keeping it open for everybody else is the hard part. Zoe nodded slowly, the way she did when she was turning an idea over rather than just accepting it, and looked back at the young mother at the counter, measuring the distance between the fear she remembered and the calm she was watching unfold now. Before they left, Marcus let her hand the very first scholarship letter to a 9-year-old boy being raised by his father alone, and watched his daughter's face as she understood, maybe for the first time, that 40 was 762's 1918. 40 had never been what made him matter. What mattered was that he'd had the power to seek revenge, and chose instead to make sure the next person through that door would be treated like they belonged there from the start. They walked out together, finally continuing the plans that had been interrupted 3 months earlier, a stop at the bookstore on Chalmers Avenue, then dinner at diner Zoe liked, the one with the milkshakes. If you had been standing in that lobby the day it started, would you have kept your phone raised and said nothing? Or would you have been the first person to speak up for a father and his daughter who hadn't done a single thing wrong? Nobody should ever need $5 million to be treated with basic respect. Marcus didn't win the moment Richard Halloway recognized him. He won the moment he used that recognition to make sure this person through those doors, whoever they were, whatever they wore, however much money they carried, would never have to prove they belonged. If this story stayed with you, go ahead and subscribe for the next one, and carry this with you if you're still standing in a room where somebody else is being underestimated. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person living or any actual establishment. Any resemblance to some persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. It does not make factual claims about any individual, company, or institution.